welcome to our Slow Garden Center webinar. Today is Plant a Cut Flower Garden, and as always, we are recording these live with our amazing community. If you have any questions, you can join us and ask those questions with us. My name is Taylor. I'll be your moderator today, and our speaker is the amazing Kylea from our Pleasant Hill store. Take it away, Kylea.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. It's a good day for talking about flowers. Well, the sky is a little bit grayer because these will certainly brighten the day a little bit. I definitely wanted to start by saying that there are so many flowers out there that are just so varied in terms of what textures and colors they can really bring to an indoor bouquet. So I'm going to go over a few of them. I'm not necessarily going to catch everyone that's out there, but if there are any ones that you guys have questions about, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box that's down below. We'll see if we can get to them or if maybe I don't know. Maybe we do. We'll see. Now I'm going to start by doing a little slideshow that is going to be just giving me some basics. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now. All right, so this is going to be about my personal favorite tips and tricks to planting a cut flower garden. So of course, when we're talking about garden planning, there's a lot of the same conversation that's going to be the start of that conversation. For example, when is it sunny where you're planning on planting or in your garden in general? If it's more of a afternoon sun sort of situation, you're going to need to go with something that can handle that hot afternoon sun that we get, especially over here in Pleasant Hill. We definitely have a very harsh, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. window where if you get a plant that says it's, partial sun, you put that in that space that's getting that 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. window. And unfortunately, that flower is usually going to burn. There are definitely some exceptions to that rule, but it is always important to plant the plants that will work for your space. Of course, if you've got a little corner where you've got a slightly different lighting situation in your garden, I always like finding the exceptions within our own gardens where we can make a little something extra fit in there. So the other question is going to be, what's your microclimate? Over here in Contra Costa County, we're in a Mediterranean climate, which means we have winter wet, summer dry is at least the idea behind that statement. And that will greatly change what plants we have available, especially when it comes to cut flower gardens. A lot of people, when they think of a cut flower garden, they think of like baby's breath, which isn't really something that grows here. It's something that you can grow, but you'll only really find it as seed. In our area, it doesn't really grow as like a plant that you can pick up at the store. But thankfully it does come in some of the like different flower mixes that we've got, like this one from Botanical Interest, that's Grandmother's Cut Flower Garden. I like this one a lot because it has quite a few different varieties of not only annuals, but also perennials that work as cut flowers. And then one of the things that we don't even realize that we have already available for our cut flowers is going to be, hedges that you already have in your yard. Things like boxwoods, things like Nandina or heavenly bamboo. Those are both things that can just really add a different texture to your vase. I actually do have a couple behind me that use both of those filler sort of shrubbery. And we'll go over that after this portion. Let me know if I'm going too fast. But in the corner over here, I've got a lovely carnation. I like that picture a lot. So pretty. And carnations work as good cut flowers. That's this guy here, dianthus. Now, let's talk about annuals. When it comes to a cut flower garden, annuals are just as important as perennials. And in fact, I would say more important than perennials because the annuals are going to be what in your vase is going to fluctuate more throughout the season and really give you that sort of like holiday feel. Right now we're just moving away from Easter, but I'm already looking at, some of the things that I have around me, like these snapdragons over here. they really make me feel that sort of Easter spirit because they've got those nice pastels, the pinks, the yellows, the whites, all sorts of nice textures there. So it really does give you that sort of like Easter feel. And the same thing can be done in like fall with Rudbeckia. Rudbeckia really does kind of create that sort of fall feel, has sort of like a brown center with a yellow outer petals, and has a nice long stem that you can actually get in your vase, which is pretty important. Annuals, I like annuals because they do complete their entire life cycle in one growing season, which is going to be, pretty substantial when you're doing your cut flower garden. What I would say is that I like starting most of my annuals from seed. You can definitely pick up some jumbo packs or 4-inch from some of the sloat stores. But when you're starting them from seed, you can plant them at different times to make it so that you can make multiple cuts from your garden. So, for example, right now I've got like these delphinium seeds, which have gorgeous flowers, also from botanical interests. And what I actually like to do with these is I'll start a few of them, and then 2 weeks later, I'll start another batch of the seeds because that gives you different harvesting times so that most flowers will have a varying shelf life, and flowers like delphinium, they'll usually last in your vase for 7 to 14 days, depending on when you're picking the flower. And if you plant them at that varying times, you can keep your cut flower arrangement going for longer or do another one much sooner than you would have otherwise been able to. Otherwise, if you plant all of the seeds all at the same time, you're just going to have all your blooms at once. And hey, if you want 20 bouquets, go for it. But I prefer doing, kind of a little bit more spaced out garden planning, at least when it comes to the annuals. I do have it sorted on here by some sun-loving annuals and some shade-loving annuals. There are going to be a few things that are on here that might be missing or that are annuals in some areas and perennials in other areas. For example, the lupins that you see over here in the summer shade-loving annuals. In Pleasant Hill, some of them are going to be perennial and some of them are going to be annual, versus in San Francisco, I believe the majority of them are perennial. I might be mistaken in that statement, but I do believe that they're more on that perennial side because there's that slightly cooler climate over there. Um, yeah, beautiful. I definitely think annuals are one of the portions of the bouquet that will create so much more texture. And when I go over the flowers I have behind me, I'll show you which ones in there are annuals and why I really do think they make your bouquet pop in the end. Perennials. What is a perennial plant? Perennials are a plant that gives you multiple years of blooms and usually only one season a year. So things like your Kylea or your yarrow, things like your lavenders, look, I've got lupines on there again, your alströmerias, your dahlias, things like that are going to give you a nice, lovely bloom. They really do only bloom for one season, but they're going to be the plants that are going to be more of like staples in your yard that will make it so that when you're in between your annual planting times, you still will have something nice and flowering that's there. Especially things like the osteospermum. I've got it down here in fall sun loving, but the osteospermum, they kind of will bloom in spring and summer. And I've had a lot of customers tell me that they love using these osteospermum, also known as African daisies, as cut flowers. They do develop a slightly longer stem and have that nice daisy look for them. I will say I wouldn't really use their foliage as cut foliage just because of how low of a plant they are. It's not really tenable for most vases, but still an overall really pretty plant there. Again, I do have some listed below over here. One of my favorites that's on this list is the acanthus mollis, also known as bear's breeches, just because the way that that flower grows is it creates this upright flower stalk that has multiple florets all over the plant flower stalk, and that can just really add some height to a vase that's otherwise, a lot of lower plants. And it dries as a cut flower as well. If you wanted to do a dried flower arrangement, the acanthus mollis also works for that. And it can be really fun texturing. Usually when you're picking it as a dried flower, it would be almost into the fall season, versus the summer flower would be now. Well, not now, almost now. All right, moving on from perennials, shrubs. This is the one portion of a cut flower garden that a lot of people forget to even think about. Though shrubs have probably some of the most staple flowers in the floral industry. So things like roses, hydrangeas, and proteas are some of the most eye-catching plants. And in fact, down here, this is actually a picture of a hydrangea in the corner. And that one, using it as a cut flower, can create so much texture just with one flower. You don't even necessarily need to put more than one flower in the vase for this one to be an already beautiful sort of arrangement. Now, not only can you get the flowers, but the foliage is also something that I already mentioned it a little bit earlier with the boxwoods and the nandinas, but they really can create texture in a bouquet that would otherwise be missing something. So for example, you can see here I've got some red valerian as the flower, but this foliage that's sticking out, that's actually a boxwood there. They can definitely add that missing sort of pop that the bouquet would otherwise, you know, not look as nice without, look a little sparser without it. So I have a list over here that have some of my personal staples, but look around your yard. Things like Raffia lepis, I didn't put it on here, but it would work as a cut flower. Things like your, did I put rosemary on there? I did, beautiful. Um, Gosh, my brain is, the like dwarf myrtles work really well as a cut flower. I didn't put it on here at all, but there are also trees, flowering trees that are going to be early spring bloomers that will also work in sort of floral arrangements. Things like flowering cherries, flowering plums. Even if they're fruiting, you can technically pick them when they're flowering to use them for your cut flower garden. Especially if you're noticing that you're having a lot of flowers all over the tree, it's not a bad idea to go in if you see one particular spot that has a large number of flowers where you're looking at the tree and you're like, well, that branch might not be able to support that many fruits. I like using those in my cut flower arrangements. The one downside to them is that they do typically have a more woody stem. So that just means that you'll need to be a little rougher with the cut to actually allow the stem to absorb water a little bit more efficiently. And that's going to be true of a lot of shrubs. If they have that woodier stem, they do typically need to be rough cut down near the base, and then sometimes you'll even like smash it to really open the outer cambium layer to really allow your plant to absorb water in the way that we want it to in this case. All right, after the shrubs, let's just go over quickly picking a good flower. When deciding on the flowers, it's always best to choose some of the taller varieties for the longer stems. Of course, if you only really have a really short vase, it's not as big of a concern, but it's always good to have more stem than you need, because if you need, as you have your cut flowers, typically you do actually fresh cut them whenever you're replacing the water. So it's good to go with ones that have longer stems. Doesn't really matter how much foliage is on the stems, because most of the time you're stripping any of the foliage that would be within the vase. Getting support for the tall flowers that you pick out. We carry these like multi-pack stakes that are my go-to option for that. They're just bamboo stakes that are usually, we've got them in a couple different sizes, but I picked up the 4-foot ones just because they really do provide that extra stability. It's always easier as well when you're working with a slightly straighter stem in order to get it into your vase. So definitely supporting the taller varieties. Even I've seen people use like tomato cages for things like dahlias, and that has been a pretty effective route of protecting the plant and also giving it that sturdy sort of support that it needs. One thing that I definitely recommend, especially if you're newer to cutting flowers and things like that, is doing a vase test. Taking a little vase, something like this guy here, just putting one of the flowers that you wanted to use in an arrangement in it, give it like a week or so, see how long it actually does last in the vase. There are going to be resources that you can look at online. Doing a preliminary search will give you the vase life of most flowers and foliage, but there are some out there that people are like, oh, this works wonderfully. There's not really any sort of yes or no. Um, so doing a vase test is something that I definitely recommend. Okay, maintenance. Now, I actually can do a little bit of this with this bouquet here. This bouquet is actually in a bouquet that my coworker made. It's in a lovely vase that's holding like a little flower already, and this is just sweet peas. When it comes to maintaining your bouquet, you always want to start with a clean vase and clean water, of
Kylea,
course.
maybe take away the screen share for just a second while you're showing the vase to have a little bit bigger.
Yes. There we go. So when it comes down to it, it's good to make sure that you're using a clean vase and clean pruners to elongate your flower's life. It's always good to start by taking a look at what you've got going on here. I'm not seeing any sort of rot, but I will say that they could use a fresh cut because they've been in here for about 5 days now. Sweet peas, this is a sweet pea flower, by the way. Sweet peas will typically have a vase life of anywhere from 5 to 10 days. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to take some clean pruners. These are my handy dandy Corona pruners. And I'll actually be taking a diagonal cut along the very bottom here. And you want to do diagonal because that will open up a wider diameter at the base of the flower to allow for more water absorption. When you have your flowers out of the vase, now is the time when you want to go through and really remove any sort of wilting, any sort of rotting stems that you might have. I wouldn't really do like any sort of like shake test just because that can remove most of the petals that you have remaining in the plant. But see something like this where you've got one of your flowers starting to dry, just going in and giving a little trim on that base there can make it so that you have this flower for a lot longer. And so I'm not going to go through this entire thing while I'm here, just because there are a couple more that I would probably prune off. Then you just stick that back in the water. Typically, you would want to replace the water if you're wanting to be mathematically perfect with this. You would typically want to replace the water when you are doing that sort of cut. So you want to make sure that all of the foliage that's beneath where the water is going to rest in your vase is removed. Any foliage, meaning like the leaves and things like that, any of that that is going to be below the water's surface is going to just rot and cause your bouquet's life, like vase life, to be much shorter than at least it should be. So it's good to, as you're going through and maintaining your bouquets, to keep an eye out for any sort of rotting stems, any sort of rotting foliage that might have fallen in the water, and give it a fresh water every couple of days is a really good idea. Perfect ideal practices is daily, but in my life, I'm a little bit more busy than that. So having it be like every other day, I've still found works pretty well for most vases and most flowers. Some flowers have a very short vase life. So those you would definitely want to replace on a more daily consistency. Things like primrose, not usually thought of as a cut flower, but it can work as a cut flower in a pinch. But they do typically only have a 2 to 4 day vase life. So making sure to replace the water. It's usually a good idea every time that you're replacing the water to give your flowers a fresh cut. always at that angle and always trying to remove what isn't looking ideal. Now, I think that is the end of my little slideshow here. I'm going to give a little pause for any sort of questions before I move on to all of the arrangements I've got behind me.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. I like the information. It's actually really, I found it really interesting when you're talking about the maintenance of it because I guess it's something that you don't ever really think about when you're talking about cut flowers versus we talk a lot about maintenance for plants in general and taking care of your garden and taking care of your house plants and all that kinds of stuff. But these cut flowers are still a plant that is in a living state that do need water and do need to be cared for. So I really appreciate you bringing up that kind of concept. And even going over the idea that like when you're cutting them, you want to make sure that when you're rechanging the water, you cut the flower at base and also giving that nice diagonal cut. It's almost like when you're pruning a tree, you're cutting a diagonal for a different reason. It's
And
cool that there's like a connection there for like
one of
multiple
the really
reasons.
fun connections that I found working in this industry is actually cut flowers and Christmas trees. Same sort of concept. You need to keep the base submerged in water, give it a fresh cut every time you change the water. It really is that sort of like cut foliage sort of idea that will elongate your vase life. I really do like.
Yeah. I'm excited to hear a little bit more about some of your choices and things like that. And I like the thought and the idea that you really need to think about the longevity of the flower and the plant really matters on the probably structure of the flower or the plant. And there are some that like would last way, way longer than some other ones. And
Mm,
maybe if you have them all in the same arrangement, you do need to kind of come in and do that like little maintenance.
yeah.
Um, we had a couple of questions kind of coming up. You answered a few as you were going, so that worked out really well. But some people were asking about the idea of do cut flowers grow while they're actually inside the vase? Like, what's the idea of like, I mean, growing is like a different kind of concept, but like, how do they actually, do they keep on producing? Do they open up? Like, what's your ideas there?
Actually, I do have one of my arrangements over here that's going to be a good example for that. So this one here is an arrangement that I made like yesterday. And it's a combination of this is Nandina in the front with that little foliage there, a couple white roses that are around the base. And actually, right here in the middle, that's a snapdragon. And if you look closely, I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can see that there are a couple actually buds at the top that haven't opened up yet. The thing about things that have that sort of stacked flower, it depends on the individual plant, but most of them will continue to open up when they're in the vase. So really the best time to take your snapdragon sort of cuttings like that is when the plant is still right after this sort of state here. Can you see that one? It just looks like a little bud there. But right here, this one's about to open up. When that flower opens up right at the base, that's the perfect time to take your snapdragon cutting. Because you only want to have a couple of the flowers open so that the rest of them open in your vase. And you will see that sort of elongate along, the stem. What I will say is that most of them will not grow from the cuttings just because when you're thinking about flower cuttings, you're taking a cutting specifically from the flower portion of the plant, which is the reproductive portion of the plant. That being said, the reproductive portion of the plant is focusing on trying to make seeds. They're not really going to focus on trying to make roots. So when you are using cut foliage, that might actually create a sort of root in the water, just like if you were propagating like a house plant or something like that. So a great example of that is actually, I'm just showing off all my bouquets at this point. A great example of that is in this bouquet, which is my only edible bouquet of all of these options. But it is a combination of nasturtium and actually basil. And the basil actually will produce a root while it's sitting in water for a period of time. So that is something that you could theoretically replant in your garden when you're done with it. Things like tibicina or princess flower, if you get foliage cuttings, can also produce roots in the vase and then also be grown afterwards. But I will say the majority of them, they may continue to open up their flower, but they're not really going to be doing a huge amount of growth from that point.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And I think it also is interesting where you could have this combination of nice floral arrangements inside your house, but also you could be getting a couple cuttings if you do some foliage cuts or plants that would maybe grow roots, and then you're getting more plants, and we all love that.
That's definitely one of the better parts of being on the cut flower arranging side. If anything that you guys are using for these cut flower gardens has more of a square stem that's a little bit hairier, that is almost positively going to grow a root in that water for you. What I will say is that if you're doing the proper bouquet maintenance where you're cutting the base more frequently, you might not get as many roots out of the plant. It's just going to depend on where that plant is trying to grow the roots from. If it's one of the higher nodes or just right from the very base, it does vary.
Yeah. And then one last question we'll ask now, as you probably are going to continue on, we'll maybe ask some more. But you have a nice dianthus actually right there in frame, and someone was asking how you would cut carnations to have those best success.
Well, I find with carnations going really deep towards the base here. And then I use actually carnations in this one here from this plant here in front of me. And I like to harvest them when they're just starting to open up. When the bulb of the flower is still nice and stiff, when it's on this sort of on its way out, it gets really, really, really squishy, which is not going to last very long in your vase. But when it's nice and tough still, that's really the best time to do your harvesting on them. And then you can harvest them while they still have flower buds. They may or may not open. It just depends on the individual cutting, whether or not they open. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They're kind of odd in that way. But even if they don't, they do still provide a fun sort of texture for the bouquet. So yeah, like this one right at the top that has that, you can see the flower is just starting to come out. That is pretty much like the perfect flower to put in your vase. These guys are a little older, but they would still work. They just wouldn't have as long of a vase life. All right. So from there, I'm going to show you folks a couple seeds before I really dive into the stuff that's going on behind me, just because I know there's a lot, and the seeds are going to be something that I'm going to totally forget about talking about if I don't do it right now. So I already mentioned a couple of the botanical interest ones that I like, including the grandmother's cut flower garden. But when it comes to cut flower arrangements, one of the first things that most people think of are zinnias. And one of my favorite varieties, we actually carry it in like 3 different packages, but they're these cut and come again zinnias. They grow these nice sort of stems. And if you actually will take your cutting a little bit early before the flower is fully opened up, that can encourage the plant to send out 2 more blooms, kind of like little arms off of the plant, which can get your blooming season longer, which is always ideal, especially because these guys are annual plants in our area. So getting as many blooms as possible is always ideal. Now, in terms of some things that we get as seeds that we don't really see as plants in the stores, but are still things that I want to be on your mind when you're doing your flower garden for the year, is going to be things like the amaranth. This one's definitely going to be a fun sort of spiller that would be around the base of your vase to very much accentuate what it is that you're doing. With amaranth, I specifically like to do floral arrangements that are front-facing floral arrangements. Instead of the floral arrangements that you use as like the centerpiece on your table, putting it up against a wall, like on your entryway table, that's the sort of display that I like to do with them, and giving them that sort of paper around the back to support the flowers that are behind them, and then have the amaranth spill over can really create some fun textures when you're doing a cut flower. I also want to mention Amis. These guys, I don't know how well that flower, there we go, is looking, but these guys add some really fun textures and height to your vases, and kind of give you that sort of spring sort of, what's it called? Gosh darn it, dandelion vibes. All right, and I'll set those aside. I mentioned those. One of my recent favorites has been Status. And there are actually some Status varieties that are like blue like this, but there's also some pink ones, some yellow Status and things like that that we don't ever see in the stores. We really only see the Limonium Perezii, which is the purple at the stores because that's the perennial variety in our area. A lot of the other statuses, which are like the Limonium cinnatum, are on that more annual side. But the flowers have this sort of cool long flower stalk and then open flower up at the top that's like this sort of, how do I even describe that? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
this umbel flower or like a yeah,
yeah.
a multi-flower coming out top. I really like Status too because that paperiness of them, that
And
long-lasting
that's
paper.
actually one thing I wanted to mention about them. That paperiness makes them a perfect selection for dried flower arrangements as well. I do actually have one of my bouquets here that is almost exclusively Status because she is so pretty. And the thing about it is that this is actually two different stages of the same Status flower, where you can have a little bit of that texture from the flower buds and from the flowers themselves. So, gone over that one. And then let's just do real quick a couple of my favorite fillers that most people don't think of as their initial fillers in a vase. So grasses, I know I did a grasses webinar a couple months ago, but I love using the grass flowers as a accent in the vase. One of my go-tos recently has been this grass frosted explosion from Botanical Interest. Has such a fun sort of texture that it adds to your vase, almost gives like 4th of July sort of fireworky sort of feeling. Frosted explosion, gee, I wonder. Now another one that I've been really enjoying using recently, and I actually already mentioned it in my edible flower arrangement behind me, is basil. A lot of people don't think of basil as a cut flower, but it adds an aroma to your vase. It does actually flower with a really nice purple stacking sort of flower that is, I wouldn't say as aromatic as the leaves themselves are, but still something that you can add as a addition to your vase. And they just really do fill in around the sides pretty well. And they do have that sort of lighter green texture most of the time that will help contrast some of the darker greens that some of our preferred flowers have naturally. Those are the majority of those that I actually wanted to touch on. Is there any specific planter vase going on behind me that we wanted to touch on?
Mm. I like the slightly taller one between the nasturtium and then the little yellow one. What's happening there?
So this bouquet is almost entirely foliage. There is only one flower, well, two flowers in this entire arrangement. This is a combination of Nandina and Leucospermum in the middle there, and the leucadendron right there. And I actually also have, I don't know if you can see it very well, a couple eucalyptus leaves up top that add the aroma that, in my opinion, this bouquet was missing. And then these guys in the middle are just a couple snapdragons. And again, yeah, I did pick them when they still have a few closed buds to allow for them to continue to have a slightly longer vase life. The earlier you pick flowers like this, the longer vase life they're going to have. So yeah, I'm a really big fan of this one. Definitely adds some like more, this one I almost say like kind of feels more fall-y than most of the other ones that I have over here. And it is one that most of these things are going to be available during the fall time. So you can recreate this sort of arrangement, especially if you've got heavenly bamboo in your yard. It just really adds a fun texture. You can see my craziness.
Yeah, I think the Nandina is a really interesting idea. I like that plant a lot, and I do recommend it quite often to people who want a nice foliage plant for their garden that has some color on it. But using it as a cut flower is like even getting another bit of love out of it, and you can last it for longer. And trimming it back is always a nice idea.
Yeah,
The one other,
absolutely.
the one other thing I would like to maybe just speak on for that flower arrangement is you have a nice snapdragon in the middle as your centerpiece, but everything else around it will probably last well beyond the snapdragon's bloom. Do you have a like succession of flowers you'd like to switch into them? How do you approach that?
Actually, I have a couple of these snapdragons that I was thinking of filtering into that once those two have failed me, just because these ones are still planted in soil, and so they'll last me a little bit longer than the ones that are in that vase. But the good thing about that arrangement is that it doesn't need a flower for it to feel complete. But the flower is just going to add that extra oomph. One of the things that I like to add to it is actually grevilleas. Once the grevilleas are in their full summer bloom, that's I think what I'm going to move it to after I'm done with these snapdragons. Just because it has that sort of like spidery like texture, which I feel like is going to play really well with the Nandina that already kind of has that sort of floaty texturing to it. And it'll create another different variation from what's going on in there. That's kind of the thing about these bouquets, though, is that they can be one singular flower and still be a beautiful bouquet and a floral scented bouquet. Like this one that my coworker Marilyn made is just sweet pea flowers. It doesn't have anything in it except for that. And I've still been smelling it every day. So, and then I have this one that I showed earlier is only two different plants. It's just so varied how many things you actually need to put in your arrangement for it to be a pretty arrangement. That's why I was mentioning earlier about those hydrangeas. Just one in a vase can be a really pretty arrangement. I before I leave, I did kind of want to do a little example vase. I do have this yellow vase given to me by my brother-in-law. And it already has a little bit of water in it. So it's ready to go. I have a couple different things behind me that I actually haven't spoken about yet. So one of them that I wanted to mention is cosmos. And cosmos are so pretty. They have such a pretty flower texture as well. And they do have those nice wide blooms. They work really well as a sort of filler flower that you put in between your foliage and like your focal point. In this situation, what I really want to use, it's been staring at me since yesterday while I was making all the other bouquets, is this sweet pea, this polygala. Polygala has such a fun texturing to it that even that just this by itself almost feels like a complete bouquet, but it's not. So we're gonna add a bunch of shenanigans. The one thing I will always say is that you can see my diagonal cut here. Just make sure that any foliage is completely out of the way because that is never a fun thing to happen upon. That's a little tall for me, so I'm gonna go in and actually trim this specific branch off. And that's the cool thing about flower arranging is that it is an art. So you can go through and be like, I don't know if I like that one branch. It's not doing it for me. And then just go in and you can even reuse this portion where I'm just going to take this. You always want to strip. And this is what I mean when I say strip. You just, goodbye. I like using typically gloves when I'm doing that. I don't have them on me right now. So here we are. Tuck that in there too. And you already have some nice purple flowers around the very outer edge there, which have been, oh, that's already looking nice. Okay. So there's step one. I'm gonna put my other one back in water and I might use more of it later, I might not. And then what I have been itching to use is more of these snapdragons. And oh, there it is. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is ferns. Ferns work really well as cut flower arrangements, and especially ones like the asparagus fern. It adds such a fascinating little just whoosh of green. And it adds a textural component too, if you actually wanted to feel your vases. I have a little brother that likes to do that, so that's why I mentioned that. So I'll go in and I like measuring my cuttings to my vase. So my vase is still a little bit tall for my vase. So I actually want it like there. So I'm gonna go in and cut. I'm still doing my diagonal cut. There we are. And then I'm gonna take the bottom there, strip. And all of these little pieces can be composted later. So I like just putting those in my compost pile, and that works pretty darn well. And I've got one in there. I got this one, and actually this will be a good opportunity to talk about the weirdly shaped things that you got going on. This one almost wants to be a Z right now. So I want to turn this into actually two different cut flowers. To do that, let's see, I have it to here. I want it to be about where that bend is in the branch. So I'm going to take my first cutting, kind of bend the foliage away, take my cutting right above one of the leaves, and then do my little measuring, remove all the foliage that's beneath the water surface. And then I've got half. And now the important thing about this, if you are going to be recreating this sort of idea, is you want to make sure that the stem that's going into the water is the correct facing way. Otherwise, it's not going to actually move that water through the stem. So you do want to make sure that it's still upright, or whatever this plant's version of upright is. So in this case, it is lopsided, but I can also change that with a little cut down at the base here. And then that actually creates a sort of texture for me. And that's the thing about doing this sort of arranging, is that you're going to have some inherent quirks in the plant material that you're using. And so working around it is going to be one of the best ways to actually create some textures. Texture has been one of my favorite words this webinar.
Another thing I'm liking that you're demonstrating in this kind of flower arrangement is that this is a fairly large mouth or wide vase compared to some of the ones you had before, which kind of hold just a couple flowers very upright. You have to work with this wider mouth to then build up, and the foliage really helps with that.
Exactly. That's what I do like the foliage for, is it does create that fill for these sorts of big vases that you're otherwise like, I've got two little flowers and I can see a whole lot of vase. So I definitely am on the let's fill that vase so I can't see as many. Now, one of the things that I wanted to use in this one is actually got a couple rose cuttings here. And now roses are one of the staples of the flower garden, the cut flower garden world. But they are also the ones that people have perfected the most in terms of how best to use them as a cut flower. So one of the things that is always going to be important is removing a lot of these spines, just because it's hard to work with the roses by hand when you do have them on there. What I will be looking at for roses is you do want to, just like with the dianthus or the carnations, you do actually want a more tight flower if you can help it. In this case, I have one spent flower up at the top that I don't want in my bouquet. So I'm just going to trim that right off. And in fact, I'm going to remove these lower leaves as well, because they're not going to do anything for me. There we go. And then that can just sit right in front of this bouquet here. Right, like that. As you're putting the roses in, I always look for any sort of like failing petals, any sort of bruised petals. That one cutting that I'm looking at right now doesn't have very much of that, so I'm going to leave it mostly as is. This one will have a little bit better of an example for us. So again, another spent flower here. So I'm just going to go in and prune that right off. Goodbye. And then again, removing some of the needles from here. Pruners are key. and sharp pruners are key. So, and then again, I'm going to remove those lower leaves. And then when you're looking at the roses, the sort of petal that you would want to remove are like ones like that, where you can sort of see there's a little bit of a malformation in that petal. So you can actually just go in and just pluck that right off. You don't need something in your vase that's going to cause more stress. There you go. And actually, I want this flower to open up a little bit more. So you can actually go in there and gently push it apart with your fingers. Kind of, I like to go kind of in like a circular fashion, working from the outer petals inwards a little bit, just to kind of create a second texture on here. There we go. And see, that's the before and after.
Yeah, and that kind of just a little bit of that touch helps out if maybe you're setting up an arrangement and people are coming over in 3 hours. And you're like, I need to get my flowers
Exactly.
popping.
Precisely that, and it will just create a second layer of flowers. Having, open and closed can kind of, it just makes it prettier, in my opinion.
It looks more alive too.
Yeah, definitely. And as those older flowers start to die off, some of those younger ones will actually open up in this case with roses, just like with snapdragons. Now, at this point, it's looking pretty nice. I need something in the middle there, in my opinion. So let's put something in the middle. I have some really pretty pink snapdragons that have been calling my name. So let's put those in there. I like playing with colors while I'm doing this as well. I will say I have not studied color theory, but I'm sure if you did, it would be very helpful in your flower arranging. In this case, I like going with kind of more monocolor sort of bouquets. But right here, I'm going to do kind of something contrary to that. So don't listen to that. So I'm going to go in and let's see. Actually, this will be a better sort of example for us. So I'm going to go in. These are my snapdragons. I'm going to go in and take my cutting real close to the base here. Right there. Got it at that angle. I'm going to do a couple yellows in here and a couple. Let's see, 1, 2. Let's do a couple of these pinks too. I'm going to go snapdragon heavy on this because these guys are really popping their stems for me. There we go. And if I want more, I have more. Ooh, put that over there. And then again, you measure your flower to your vase always. So that's actually about perfect where it's at right now. So take the bottom, strip that foliage, and then you just kind of feed it in to the middle there. I'll do that a couple more times. Yeah, that's about a good size for it. Just a piece. Go. One thing that you can use, I don't have any on me today, but it's definitely helpful to do when you're doing your arrangements, taking some what's called raffia or some twine and tying that around the base of your bouquet can help keep it a little bit more upright. I prefer when mine are a little bit more sprawly. I do like the kind of more natural look. But when you're having guests over, I would definitely go the route of kind of tying the base. And it also makes it easier when you're changing your water and when you are, actually, I like that at the height that it's at. There we go, goodbye, leaves. Makes it easier when you're doing your fresh cuts on your flowers to actually have that available. So right now, this is looking pretty good. I think I need more foliage to fill in the back because I really do want to make this a one-sided vase. So I'm going to go back to my good old reliable sweet pea because I have more of that. And my pruners are here somewhere. I just used them. They're there. All right, do a little cut. And sweet peas are going to be one of the ones that have a slightly woody stem. So if you want a super long vase life out of these, you would crush the bottoms a little bit more. I
Yeah, I actually had a question about that because I know the trimming the bottom into a nice little diagonal cut is helpful, but I have heard about people crushing the bottoms. And I want to know what your thought about that.
So I really only recommend crushing the bottoms of your cut flowers when it's a more woody plant. In this case, and you don't necessarily need to crush it. So for example, what I just did here, you can see I created an actual cut in the bottom here to give it more surface area of that inner tissue for the plant to actually absorb more water. And that's
Yeah,
like the whole idea of the crushing as well, is just creating more areas where your um, flower is going to be able to, and in fact, I'll do that on camera, where your flower is able to absorb more water. So again, right here, kind of just going in and doing a little cut right along the middle. Same sort of concept as when you're grafting almost. Here we go. Doesn't need to be perfect. And that can go in there and help hold these guys up.
very nice. It also gives that concept of when plants are flowering or fruiting or producing these really energy intensive structures, they usually need more water. And this is the same concept of you're trying to keep something with flowers alive, so you allow it to pull more water.
Exactly. Precisely. Do. And I will put, at this point, I'm just filling the vase. So if there are any questions or anything like that, now's probably a good time for us to go through a few of those.
As we come towards the end of our little session, I had someone asking about your opinions on using, I think I know where they're going with this, but lemon verbenas or salvias in your arrangements.
I actually really like using sages in arrangements, especially like the native Salvia apiana that has that sort of more white, sort of fuzzy texturing to it. And salvias are in that sort of family that's pretty easy to propagate when they're in water. So they will theoretically root for you, and they will typically have a pretty long vase life. So I definitely recommend them. They also give you some more floral sort of smells in your house. And I do like sages, especially because they will be blooming well into the year and you can make them rebloom later in the year as more of like a fall arrangement sort of option. I will say that one of the ones that I really also like for arrangements like that is Perovskia, which is Russian sage. So that one will also have sort of that more airy texturing to it because of the leaf shape that it has, and a nice purple flower. I'm a sucker for purple flowers, so I am never going to say no to putting a purple flower in a bouquet.
Yeah. And a lot of the flowers that Kylea is showing off and talking about, almost I think everything actually you've talked about today, are in our stores right now. I know that all of our stores have these plants in stock and they're ready for you to plant. So if you're interested in any of them or you want to walk around and see some of these, any of our locations would help you out with that.
Mhm. Absolutely. I will say it's a little late in the year for most of like the snapdragons and things like that. They're definitely ones that you plant in winter for harvesting about now. Same is going to be true of things like daffodils. It's a little late in the year to be getting those. But I will say that there might be more flowering in your yard than you initially think. Daffodils will bloom much later in the year or earlier in the year, just depending on when they were planted in years prior. I've had daffodils as like a fall blooming plant and as a spring blooming plant. So don't forget your bulbs. Obviously, lilies are some of the most staple options for flower arrangements, just because there are so many different lilies out there and they really can. So that one pretty much finished. I think I'm happy with that. I might put another snapdragon in the middle or two, just make it all snapdragons. But I do want to mention lilies while we're here. So this arrangement actually has some alstroemeria in it, which is known as the Peruvian lily. This vase, I do actually want to touch on this one for a little bit, just because this vase has one of the things that Tyler Taylor was talking about earlier. And that's multiple plants that have varying vase lives. So most of these plants that I have in here, the limonium, the status with this purple and white flower, the Peruvian lily, the alstroemeria here, and the eucalyptus, all are about 1 to 2 week vase lives. But if you actually look close at the bottom there, I added a little bit of basil in for some smell and some texture. And basil's vase life is only typically 5 to 7 days. So when I'm taking this out of its vase to give it a fresh cut, basil is going to be one of the first things that I'm either going to remove or replace in this vase. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're doing your arrangements. You don't necessarily need to use flowers that have the same exact vase life, but it's a good idea to keep track of which ones have the shortest vase life, just so you can be on top of any rot that might be happening in your vase.
Very nice. Well, I think we are coming about to the end. And one last thing I wanted to just note is if you are watching this live or you're watching this in the mid-late spring to early summer season, all of our stores are right now full of flowers. Especially I wanted to mention roses came into all of our stores, and we have plenty and plenty of all the colors of roses, which are, as Kylea said, one of those staples for flower arrangements. So if you're looking for roses, definitely come to our stores, as well as many of these other options. Is there any last kind of talks or tips or just things you want to show off before we end today?
Hmm. Don't be afraid of including your house plants in your arrangements. That's something that I feel like a lot of folks don't think of initially. For example, this maidenhair fern over here can be an amazing addition to a vase just with one of their stems, how airy they can be. Um, and yeah, go out there, have some fun. I will say, don't do California poppies. Unfortunately, they have such a short life in the vase and they really do fall apart very quickly. You can do other poppies, but not California poppies as much, unfortunately. Um, Definitely wild mustard. I would take cuttings from all of the invasive plants you see around, use them as cut flowers so that they don't spread as bad.
Yeah, well, amazing. I want to thank you again for this beautiful cut flower arrangement webinar and all the information you gave us. Thank you everyone for joining us for live presentation, and anyone watching in the future, definitely check out the rest of our classes and other stuff that we have in our stores. Kylea is actually at our Pleasant Hill store, which is going to be hosting many of our in-store classes. So if you're going to any of those, check in with her. Maybe she can show you some of the coolest flowers that are flowering in the store at this moment.
Absolutely.
And I just want to say thank you again and hope everyone has a nice rest of their Saturday.
Thank you, Taylor.